Among young Earth creationists, the idea is widespread that Leviathan was a member of the animal kingdom, a kind of marine reptile like a plesiosaur that Job had seen with his own eyes. They generally hold the view that humans and dinosaurs were created on the same day of the biblical creation week and lived side by side. The famous young Earth creationist and CEO of Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham, says the following about Leviathan in Job. Job 41 describes a great animal that lived in the sea, Leviathan, that even breathed fire. This dragon may have been something like a mighty marine reptile. The repeated references to Leviathan as a fire-breathing dragon in Job are hard to miss. Based on these verses, many young Earth creationists believe that, alongside humans, there must have lived a marine reptile that could literally breathe fire. But in doing so, they miss the meaning of Leviathan in its ancient context and read modern concepts into the Hebrew Bible. We will examine what Leviathan is. A first important clue to the dragon's identity is found in a Bible passage that young Earth creationists often overlook. Psalm 74:14 reads, "You crushed the heads of Leviathan, you gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness." Psalm 74:14. Grammatically speaking, this passage undoubtedly describes a single creature with multiple heads. This is confirmed by many scholars. It's therefore a hydra. This also rules out the possibility that Leviathan is a crocodile. This interpretation is often found in commentaries on Job 41. In the same way, although Leviathan may have some characteristics of a Nile crocodile, his fire-breathing and multiple heads refute that identification. John Day points out many other reasons that rule out identifying Leviathan as a crocodile. But why is it important that we have a biblical text describing Leviathan as having many heads? The reason is that the Israelites weren't the only people group in the surrounding lands of the ancient Near East to describe him this way. One example was the ancient port city Ugarit, located in present-day Syria. In the late 1920s, archaeologists began excavating the site. Among the finds was a temple library containing clay tablets inscribed in a previously unknown alphabetic cuneiform language. The name of this ancient city was identified as Ugarit, which is why its language was called Ugaritic. The language of Ugarit is particularly important because it turned out to be a branch of the West Semitic language family related to Phoenician and Hebrew. That means it is one of the ancient languages closest to Biblical Hebrew. The two languages therefore share numerous cognates, i.e. words, that have the same linguistic origin. This is particularly useful because there are over 1,000 unique Hebrew words in the Bible that appear only once or a few times, or whose transmission is uncertain and whose meaning is therefore unclear. Sometimes the meaning can be determined through Ugaritic. Apart from linguistic similarities, Ugarit and ancient Israel shared many common cultural expressions. In other words, as linguistically related peoples living in the same part of the world, they breathed the same cultural air. Or, to use John Walton's analogy, both, like other nations, lived within the same cultural river. This river, it flowed through the societies and thoughts of the peoples of the ancient Near East. Israel was immersed in this cultural current and held many similar ideas, though some also differed fundamentally from those of other cultures, just as every culture has its own distinct characteristics. But this does not mean, however, that Israel adopted the same ideas of the ancient Near East. Ola Wikander aptly states, "The Hebrew Bible did not borrow from Northwest Semitic culture, it is Northwest Semitic culture." And Israelite culture is a part of its Northwest Semitic context, though having its own individuality, just as its Ugaritic culture and literature does. And one does not need to borrow mythological motives from one's own culture. All of this becomes important now because we are going to examine an Ugaritic text in comparison to Isaiah 27:1, namely a passage from the Baals cycle which is significantly older than the Hebrew text. The closest neighbors of ancient Israel who preserved this myth, the Baals cycle, were the Canaanites, whose religion is best represented by the text from Ugarit. In their Baals cycle, Baal defeats the sea god Yam and thereby gains the title of king as well as the right to a palace temple. Here in this text, the god Mod reminds Baal of his victory over Leviathan. Isaiah 27 belongs to the so-called Little Apocalypse in Isaiah 24-27, which looks forward to the day when the Lord will set everything right again, that is, the eschaton. Particularly important are the similarities between these two texts regarding Leviathan and Litanu. The first is that the consonants of the Ugaritic dragon Litanu are contained within the consonants that make up the word Leviathan. That is a clear indication of the kinship between Leviathan and Litanu. But the mutual kinship between Leviathan and Litanu becomes even clearer through the related terms fleeting serpent and twisting serpent. For the term for twisted occurs only here in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. The term rendered twisted occurs only here in the Hebrew scripture, which makes it difficult to avoid the conclusion that this is a free quotation of the myth of Baal's battle with the sea monster, or perhaps a stock phrase. Ola Vikander makes it even clearer that the author of Isaiah draws on parts of the Baal cycle here. He says, "It is quite unthinkable that the combination of the serpent, Leviathan, Litan, Lotan, and these two specific words should have arisen by chance, both in Ugaritic and Hebrew literature, and so a historical connection must be postulated. This is rather well known in modern exegetical scholarship." Isaiah 27:1 thus refers to the same being that appears in the Canaanite myth. Leviathan and Litanu are one and the same, and given the cultural proximity of the two nations, this is hardly surprising. So, as we have seen, God will defeat Leviathan at the end of days, according to Isaiah 27, a reference to the eschaton, the completion of creation. Young Earth creationists postulate that Leviathan was a literal representative of the animal kingdom. The question that then arises is there still a multi-headed marine reptile like a Liopleurodon somewhere in the Atlantic today that God can then defeat at the eschaton? With that settled, let's now turn to Psalm 74. There, the psalmist again refers to Leviathan and, as we shall see, also to the same Ugaritic text as Isaiah 27:1. Yet, Psalm 74 says something completely different about the timing of Leviathan's defeat than Isaiah 27. It says there, "Yet God my King is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your might, you broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan, you gave him his food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks, you dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth, you have made summer and winter." Psalm 74:12-17. To underscore God's power to intervene whenever he wishes, the psalmist alludes here to a myth known in the ancient Near East concerning a God's victory over the sea serpent, namely, once again, the Canaanite Baal cycle which we have just examined. The cycle refers to the chaos dragon of the sea, using the same names and imagery as Psalm 74:13-14. The chaos dragon of the sea is depicted here as a multi-headed serpent which corresponds to the heads of Leviathan in verse 13. Both have multiple heads. It should also be noted, as we saw earlier, that the consonants of the Ugaritic dragon Litanu are contained within the consonants that make up the word Leviathan. The similarities between the Ugaritic text and Psalm 74 are therefore hard to miss. In other words, much like in Isaiah 27, the psalmist draws here once again on a Canaanite myth that was widely known at the time. But what is interesting is that in the context of verses 13 and 14, the dragon's defeat does not refer to the end of days this time, as was the case in Isaiah 27, but to the beginning of creation. In his dissertation, Richard Engel makes it clear that the last four lines of these verses linguistically draw on Genesis 1-2. The order of the text rather suggests a simple affirmation of the present cosmic order which extends back to the creation. The language of verses 16 and 17 duplicates vocabulary and concepts from Genesis 1-2. Old Testament scholar Michael Heiser also makes clear that much of the language in these verses can also be found in Genesis 1. He says, "The psalm has a number of allusions to Genesis 1. In the original creation chapter, God also divided the waters. Virtually all of the language in verses Psalm 74:16-17 can be found in Genesis 1. Psalm 74 thus draws linguistically on Genesis 1-2 and recounts Yahweh's battle against the dragon at creation. The problem is that Psalm 74 and Isaiah 27 thus contradict each other. Ben Stano aptly sums up this contrast between the two passages. Therefore, Psalm 74 envisions Leviathan being defeated at the creation of the world. But then, in Isaiah 27, we saw that God will smite Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent, in that day, not just at creation, but at the end of days. He goes on to clarify, "If taken literally, these descriptions of Leviathan are contradictory. Therefore, it is clear that Psalm 74 and Isaiah 27 are probably speaking in literary and symbolic terms, not narrating the ancient equivalent of a National Geographic special. We will take a closer look at one possible reason why the biblical authors drew on these myths. But before we get to that, we will first discuss other names for the dragon, for Leviathan is not the only name for this monster of chaos and the sea. This becomes particularly clear in the book of Job. Job uses the term Leviathan alongside other dragons that appear in the Ugaritic texts, the Hebrew names Tannin and Yam. These names are also used synonymously with the name Rahab and the title Fleeing Serpent. In these passages, it becomes clear that these terms are used interchangeably in the book of Job. It is striking that in the last section, Rahab bears the same title as Leviathan in the Isaiah passage, and that Litanu is also referred to as the fleeing serpent in the Ugaritic texts. Rahab is also referred to as a fleeing serpent, just like Leviathan in the Hebrew Bible and Litanu in the Ugaritic texts. It is also important that Job mentions Yam, since in the Ugaritic text, the fleeing serpent Litanu is likewise used in connection with both Yam and Tannin. Earlier in this text, this tyrant is referred to as Litanu. What all this shows is that the names Yam, Litanu, Rahab, Tannin, and Leviathan are all overlapping names. As we have seen, they are often used interchangeably. As we have seen so far, both Ugaritic and biblical texts associate this monster with the sea. But why then does God fight against the sea in Isaiah 27 and Psalm 74? And why does he do so at different times, once at creation and then at the eschaton? Canaanite literature, i.e. the Ugaritic Baal cycle we just examined, describes how the storm god Baal defeats Yam, the god of the sea, to become the head of the Canaanite pantheon. We will briefly examine this battle because it conveys an important motive that is taken up in Psalm 74. At the start of the battle, Yam clearly has the upper hand, which is why another god intervenes to encourage him. To support him, he uses incantations to enhance the power of two clubs, with which Baal then defeats Yam. And after Baal has killed this enemy, he is proclaimed king. Baal's dominion over the forces of the sea thus demonstrated his kingship. He defeated Yam and was then proclaimed king. Similar symbolism can also be found in Psalm 74. As in the Ugaritic text, the battle between Leviathan and Yahweh is linked to a struggle for cosmic power and divine kingship. Thus, Yahweh is the great victorious king of the cosmos who crushes the heads of the sea monsters and feeds their carcasses to the beasts of the desert. In verses 15 to 17, however, the text reflects God's work of creation in the world. The victorious king is also the creator. The beginning of Psalm 74 describes how the Babylonians conquered Judah. The verses express the author's heartfelt plea for divine intervention in the face of suffering and oppression. It's a lament psalm about the destruction of Yahweh's temple. Bernard Batto says, a similar picture emerges from Psalm 74, which also was composed during the Babylonian exile. With the images of the infidel Babylonian army razing Jerusalem and desecrating Yahweh's temple palace on Mount Zion still fresh in his mind, the psalmist challenges Yahweh to act. After the psalmist has turned to God to lament the atrocities his enemies have committed against the Lord's sanctuary, the theme of the psalm shifts. The psalmist recalls God's mighty acts of creation. And this is significant because of the parallels to another text from the ancient Near East, namely the Babylonian creation account Enuma Elish. That is, how the Babylonians themselves, who had conquered Judah, believed the world had been created. Much like Yahweh's victory over Leviathan and Baal's battle against Yam, the god Marduk fought a chaos dragon named Tiamat. After defeating this enemy, he split Tiamat's body in two, creating the heavens from one half and the earth from the other. After placing the celestial bodies in the sky, Marduk then formed clouds from the dragon's spit. The head became a mountain, and the Tigris and Euphrates gushed forth from the eye sockets. And similar parallels also appear in the biblical text. For example, Job 41:2 says the following regarding Leviathan. Can you put a rope in his, Leviathan's nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Job 41:2. The biblical text is not alone in this. Ben Stano points out that Mesopotamian art often depicted gods standing on defeated chaos dragons and monsters, symbolizing their power. On the left, Marduk is seen standing on a pedestal, symbolizing the defeated sea. On the right, the god Adat is shown with a tame chaos dragon tied by the snout or nose. Stephen Moll comments, Numerous depictions of Mesopotamian gods, which often show the cult images venerated in the temples, illustrate this mythic motive. They depict a deity standing on an animal or a dragon-like hybrid creature, which is often led by a rope whose ends the god holds in his hand. These so-called emblematic animals are nothing more than the defeated mythical adversaries of the deity who, now domesticated by the god, must place their power entirely at the service of a new master. In Babylonian religion, the Chaos Dragon had to be defeated, and its waters were constantly held back by Marduk so that life on earth could rise and continue. And the psalmist, he does the same. He points out that if Yahweh is powerful enough to maintain the order of the created world by defeating the chaotic forces of the sea, then it can easily defeat Israel's current enemy as well, the Babylonians who had destroyed the Lord's sanctuary. Robert Alter says, if God is powerful enough to have secured the order of the created world by conquering the hideous forces of aqueous chaos, he can surely confront the vile enemy who has laid waste Zion. This becomes particularly clear in verses 14 to 18. They depict God's victory over the sea monsters by parting the waters. As seen earlier, the psalmist draws linguistically on Genesis 1 to 2 here and recounts Yahweh's battle against the chaotic forces of the sea at the time of creation. Yet, when we turn to Genesis 1 to 2, we notice that there is no mention at all of Yahweh's battle against the forces of chaos in the sea. Genesis 1, 2 and 6 to 7 say, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, tehom. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse, and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. Genesis 1, 2 and 6 to 7. Various terms have repeatedly sparked discussions among scholars in the past regarding possible motives of the battle against chaos in Genesis. Particular attention has been paid to the term for depth in verse 2. In the past, this term has often been compared to the name Tiamat, the monster of chaos, who was defeated by Marduk in connection with the creation of the world in Enuma Elish. Hermann Gunkel, for example, speculated that the Hebrew word was equivalent to Tiamat, who was killed by Marduk. He saw in Genesis 1:2 a reference to Mesopotamian creation myths. However, the earlier view that tehom indicated a borrowing from the Babylonian tradition in which the primeval waters are personified as Tiamat has proven to be incorrect. Although the Babylonian and Hebrew terms for depth, ocean, derive from a common Semitic word, it is not a derivative of Tiamat. John Day aptly notes, the word translated deep in Hebrew, tehom, is philologically related to the Akkadian Tiamat, the chaos monster whose name means sea, defeated by Marduk in connection with the creation of the world as narrated in Enuma Elish. It should not be held, however, as Gunkel and many after him have maintained that Hebrew tehom is actually derived from Akkadian Tiamat. It's sometimes pointed out that tehom is used without a definite article, which is understood as a distant echo of the mythical battle with Tiamat, the female personification of the forces of chaos. Earl Joyner also points out that tehom is written here as a proper noun, which suggests an earlier connection to well-known mythological material. However, Tsumura convincingly demonstrated that in Genesis 1 other words are also sometimes used without the definite article when there should not be. Therefore, this is not evidence of personification. Richard Everbeck also points out that tehom in Genesis 1 does not express resistance to God's creative activity. It is neither personified nor does it resist God's creative work. It does not pose a challenge to God or his creative work. John Walton says something similar. He says, while both darkness and the watery deep, tehom, are elements of chaos, neither is personified here. This lack of personification in Genesis removes from the element of chaos any sense of evil. This means that the background of the creation story in the book of Genesis has nothing to do with the Mesopotamian myth of the struggle against chaos as it's preserved in the Babylonian creation myth Enuma Elish. There is no mention in Genesis 1 of a battle or conflict between God and the tehom waters. But this raises another contradiction. Psalm 74, as we have seen earlier, locates Yahweh's battle with the chaotic forces of the sea at the time of creation, while Genesis 1 makes no mention of a chaos battle motive. Even if tehom is a reference to Mesopotamian creation myths, it offers no resistance to God's work of creation. So, what is going on in Psalm 74? As already mentioned, in Babylonian religion, the chaos dragon needed to be defeated so that life on earth could come into being and be sustained. And Psalm 74, whose background is the Babylonian conquest of Judah, uses this motive and draws on various legends of powerful gods to replace them with Yahweh. Ben Stanhope sums this up well. He says, "When we read Psalm 74 in this context, we see it as a slap in the face of the pagan gods. It takes the same epic story, erases hotshot gods like Baal or Marduk, and inserts Yahweh. Yahweh is the real dragon slayer. He is the one who defeated the oceanic forces of chaos and created the world, and he alone, not Baal or Marduk, deserves worship as its rightful king." The psalmist uses polemics against the religious beliefs of his pagan neighbors. He challenges the power of the gods Baal and Marduk by portraying Yahweh as the true dragon slayer. Daniel Estes addresses the psalm's polemic against the Canaanites. He says, "This passage is a polemic against the Ugaritic myth of Baal conquering Yam and Leviathan, the forces of chaos, and re-establishing his control over nature each year. By refuting rival creation stories of surrounding pagan cultures, the people indicate their confidence that no force lies beyond the Lord's control. His awesome sovereign power is able to crush every power that rises against him or his people." Trent Butler and Douglas Mangum say, "The Bible uses language about the sea and serpents or dragons to show God's superiority over all creation and creatures. At the same time, the psalmist calls on Yahweh to act so that he may deliver them from their enemies. He is the one who crushed the heads of the sea monsters. He is powerful enough to maintain the order of the created world through victory over the chaotic forces of the sea. So, why does he not deliver them?" By using this culturally relevant analogy, the psalmist intensifies his appeal for Yahweh to act. If common myth claimed that the gods attained their kingship and palace through a battle against the sea, should not Yahweh restore his own temple, the symbol of his kingship? For he is the true creator and victor of all the forces of chaos and evil. However, as Ben Stanhope points out, it's important to note that the authors of Genesis 1 didn't literally believe in a battle between Yahweh and the chaotic forces of the sea. Instead, the biblical writers sometimes used these myths to undermine them by portraying Yahweh as superior. John Hilber sums this up. Even as the Old Testament authors drew imagery from the culture of their time, they did so in a way that undermined the belief system of the pagan world around them. The rule of Yahweh over his creation might be expressed using the cultural images of a chaos conflict, but this is no real challenge to his ultimate sovereignty, as this playful description of Leviathan demonstrates. Rather than a representative of the animal kingdom, Leviathan was a chaos monster that was widespread in the legends of the ancient Near East. At times, the biblical writers took up this motive, for example, to challenge the power of great gods by portraying Yahweh as the true dragon slayer. They employed polemics directed against the religious beliefs of their pagan neighbors. What we have seen is, in Psalm 74, God's victory over Leviathan precedes the creation of the world. In Genesis 1, however, there is no reference to a conflict between God and the chaotic forces of the sea. Isaiah 27 describes Leviathan being slain at the eschaton. Yet, as Ben Stanhope aptly notes, there is no surviving Liopleurodon in the Atlantic for God to defeat at the end of time. Leviathan bears the same titles as an older chaos dragon from the ancient Near East. And, according to Job 41, Leviathan can breathe fire, and according to Psalm 74, has multiple heads. I hope this video has helped you to find an answer to the question of what Leviathan was. Feel free to follow me on Instagram, and see you in the next video.